Hello, my name is Ayelet Connell, and this is an episode of Simply Paleo with me. Today we're going to be making paleo pizza and broccoli rabe pesto sauce, and it is really a delicious, delicious pizza. For those of you that are new to the paleo diet, understanding the ins and outs of what makes a paleo-friendly diet, essentially one of the biggest pieces, the biggest aspects of the paleo diet that defines it is the lack of grain. So that means no wheat, none of the glutinous grains, but also none of the gluten-free grains. So that includes no rice, no millet, no amaranth. And the reality is that a lot of those grains definitely have some beneficial nutritional properties. But unfortunately, they also have phytic acid in them and other elements that make them hard for us to digest optimally when there's any sort of inflammatory condition. And for many people, they have gut disorders, an imbalance of the microbiome. There's so many reasons why we might want to implement an anti-inflammatory diet. And at the basis of an anti-inflammatory diet is really eliminating grain. So typical paleo flours or flour blends include a variety of nut flours, coconut flour. The biggest common one is almond flour. And obviously there's a lot of nutritional benefits to almond flour, but there are many people out there that are trying to do the paleo diet but can't eat nuts. And in my family, we have some nut sensitivities. So we, of course, have to find alternatives to nut flours in this paleo lifestyle. So typically, one of the more common flours that we use that's nut-free is made out of a root vegetable called cassava root. And some of you may not be familiar with the term cassava root, but you might be more familiar with its other name, which is tapioca root. So tapioca starch is a component of a lot of different flour blends, gluten-free and also paleo. But tapioca starch is the starch of essentially the cassava root. And cassava flour is the whole root flour. So depending on what you're looking for in the consistency and makeup of a flour blend, you'll use one versus the other. But this particular blend that we're using to make this pizza crust is a blend of cassava flour and arrowroot powder, which is another root vegetable-based powder, and then some other seasonings and elements like that. So we're going to start off with a cup and a half of cassava root. Now before I put this in, cassava flour I should say, before I put this in I should say that I preheated the oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. And I took a baking sheet that is very similar to this one. So it's just a full-size baking sheet. And I put it in the oven before I turn the oven on. And then I preheated the oven with the baking sheet inside. Now, it's helpful to have two similar size baking sheets because then you can have one preheating in the oven that's really important to develop that crispiness of the crust, and then the other one you can use for sort of sizing the dough of the pizza. So that's what we're doing here today. You'll also notice some of my little tricks of the trade, certainly using parchment paper because it makes it easier to slide it onto the other baking sheet and also helps for cleanup and baking consistency. But I've used some binder clips, which works for me in my kitchen, to just adhere the parchment paper on for while I'm pushing the dough out to the ends, and then I'll take them off before I put it in the oven. So I'm going to place that down here, and we're going to make our dough. Now you can certainly use an electric mixer like a KitchenAid mixer, and I have one that I love to use, but in this demo I'm going to just use a big bowl, which is fine to do as well. It's a very simple batter to mix up. So we're going to take a cup and a half of cassava flour, which again is from the cassava root. And then we're going to take a cup of arrowroot powder. Now this blend will make one large rectangular pizza the size of that baking sheet, or you can make it into two half ones and make them into circles or sort of mini rectangles. And I find that that's a little bit easier in the sense that there's less of that bubbling up of the dough, but certainly I've made the long sheet pan size ones before too, and that's easy enough. So in addition to the cassava flour and the arrowroot powder, we're going to put in a teaspoon and a half of sea salt, a teaspoon and a half of Italian seasoning, and I like to use a wonderful spice company called Penzeys. It has really good quality and not so expensive spices and spice blends, and they're sourced really beautifully. But their blends are just wonderful, and they really take the work out of combining things in your own kitchen. So this Italian herb mix has Turkish oregano, basil, marjoram, thyme, and some cracked rosemary. But you can definitely make up your own blend of an Italian seasoning. So in here I have a teaspoon and a half of Italian seasoning and a teaspoon and a half of sea salt and a teaspoon of onion powder. and you can just smell that mixture. So we're going to put that in as well. Okay, and that is the bulk of our dry ingredients, and so we're just going to mix it up and try to get everything incorporated well. Okay, and then we're going to make the wet mixture separately, and then we're going to pour the wet into the dry and mix it up with a spatula or a wooden spoon, and that'll be our batter. So we're going to set this aside, and we're going to work on making the liquid ingredient. So here we have a cup of water, and into this we're going to add 2 eggs and ½ a cup of extra virgin olive oil. So we'll start off with the eggs. The order doesn't matter because in the end we're just going to whisk it up. So we're going to put in 1 egg, 2 eggs. Now these are a little bit smaller eggs. Certainly if you do larger eggs, it might change the consistency a little bit of the batter, but it should still work really well regardless. And then we're going to take ½ a cup of olive oil. Now typically when I'm making a batter for something, I'll just use definitely good quality but generic extra virgin olive oil. This one's from Trader Joe's, which works well enough, and I trust the sourcing from Trader Joe's. But if I'm making an actual pesto sauce, I'll typically use a higher quality one that has sort of a fragrance and flavor to it that is going to be more robust. So I'm going to put in ½ a cup of olive oil into this measuring cup, and then I'm just going to pour it into my wet mixture. Okay. And then I'm just going to whisk up the mixture. And just to get everything incorporated so that it's a combined liquid mixture. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this wet mixture, and you can see that it's fully incorporated now. I'm going to just get my dry mix back here, and I'm going to pour this in. Yeah. Set this aside, and then I'm just going to mix the batter. Now you got to be careful in the beginning because of course there's all that loose flour. Some of it is very starchy and will blow everywhere, but then once you start to incorporate it, you're just going to mix it into a pizza dough. And you're going to get a little bit of good arm exercise, although I imagine it's not quite as hard work as mixing up a glutinous pizza dough. I'm just going to make sure that all the ingredients are incorporated. And you'll see it's not that wet. It is sticky, so it's not like I can just use my hands and a dry rolling pin because it'll get stuck on a rolling pin. But there's lots of ways to mix this up. So here we've got our dough. And so what you can do is either roll the whole thing out on this sheet pan like one large rectangle, or you can break it up into 2 balls of dough and make just side by side the pizza doughs. And actually that's helpful also if you want to mix up the toppings. I'm going to today show you how to make a broccoli rabe pesto, which is so delicious and fragrant. But sometimes my kids aren't huge fans of the bitterness of the broccoli rabe, and it's not overt, but it's definitely there because it's a bitter green. Of course, a beautiful cruciferous vegetable, the broccoli rabe. But sometimes I'll make a second pizza with a different topping. I might make a homemade meat sauce, or I might do some homemade marinara and add on some, fresh nitrate-free pepperoni or some other ingredients. You really can mix it up. If you do dairy of some type, or good quality Parmesan, you can put that on as well. So many options, limitless. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to break this up into 2 balls, and we're going to take one and put it on the left half, and we're going to take the other and put it on the right half, and then we're going to move this bowl away, and we're going to get this baking sheet up here. And then what I found that works really well is to use a wet spatula. And so I have a cup here with water, just tap water, and I'm literally just going to dunk this, and really you'll start to see when it starts to stick, and so then you need to wet it again. And I'm just going to work on one first. And I'm literally, and these binder clips help to just keep the parchment paper intact. And I'm just going to start to spread it out, and you can make it into a circle or a mini rectangle, but it's going to take up almost half of this baking sheet. And almost touching the other side, and I'll move this out of the way so you can kind of see what I'm doing here. And I'm just literally spreading this out. You can, if you choose to use a rolling pin, which I've certainly done in the past, you can just put some saran wrap on top of the pizza dough, and that helps to roll out the dough. But I will say that that works particularly well if you're doing just one big rectangle, because otherwise it gets kind of hard with the spatula and it starts to kind of stick to the dough a little bit. So I've done that a lot, where I just have the saran wrap over this, and I just use my rolling pin. And I might take it off the baking sheet because it might be hard to get the rolling pin into the baking sheet, and then just put it back on the baking sheet after. But remember that you're going to be using another pan that's in the oven, right? That is going to come out very hot, and then you're going to transfer the parchment paper from one to the other. Okay, so we're going to make the other one as well. And so we're just going to wet this, and we're going to start to push this into the shape. And even when you're doing the small half-size ones, it's okay to do the saran wrap also. So just for essence of time with this demo, I am not using it, but it's helpful. And don't worry if the pizza dough looks a little glossy from the water that you're adding. That's not a big deal. That'll evaporate really quickly as it's being cooked, and it won't affect the texture. It's just going to help you spread out a much smoother pizza dough. I'm going to take away this cutting board that is making me tippy. Now, there's lots of different types of baking sheets that you can use. I tend to use stainless steel because, unfortunately, the aluminum pans that are so helpful as far as they're lightweight and they maintain their shape can really leach aluminum. And, of course, we use parchment paper over everything for the most part, even just because it helps with cleanup. But that aluminum is still really toxic when it's used for long periods of years and so on. So we tend to use stainless steel, but the stainless steel is, first of all, heavier, which is just a little bit awkward, which is okay. But then also in a hot oven, it tends to warp a little bit. It's not huge, the amount of warping, but enough to kind of make you wonder, what's that about? But then after it cools down, it'll just go right back to its normal shape. So not to worry about it getting ruined in the oven, but just keep in mind that that is something that will happen in a hot oven, but you don't need to worry about it. So what we're going to do is we are going to finish this up, and then I'm going to disappear briefly while I go get the hot pan, because I want to show you that process of how I transfer this. And then we're going to make the pesto sauce while this cooks, and I've actually made another crust earlier that we're going to use to put on the pesto. Okay, so this is nicely spread, and I just want to make sure the other side is nice and smooth as well. Now you'll find if you do it too thin, then you'll start to see some of the parchment in the middle of a pizza, and you just need to spread the thicker sections over. And just almost like frosting, you're trying to seal in the holes, and you can leave a little bit of thicker on the edge for a crust, and that's that. Okay, and these are our two crusts, and we're going to set this aside, and just because we have another crust that's already made for the purpose of this demonstration, but normally in my kitchen what I would do is I would pull out the hot pan, which I'm going to do so you can see how I do that, and then we're going to put that right on and in the oven. So give me a quick sec. I'm going to go get the baking sheet. I'm going to keep talking to you. Da-da-da. I'm going to get it. And keep in mind the oven is very hot, so you want to be very careful. And I'm going to get my cutting board back. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to be very careful using my hot mitts. And I'm going to get my other one back here. Okay. And I think the best thing to do is to take off these little binder clips that have been really helpful in allowing me to spread the crust so that it doesn't shimmy while I'm doing that. So now I've got my parchment paper and I'm literally just going to drag it on, and that's it. And then this is going to go in the oven as we speak. Okay, so hold on 1 second. And in the oven it goes. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to make our pesto sauce. And then we're going to use the crust that I already made to put it on. And then this is going to go into the oven for like 5 minutes. And then we're going to give it a try. So let's see here. We've got our food processor, which is definitely a key ingredient for making the pesto. So what we're going to start off with first is we're going to have a bunch of broccoli rabe. So they typically come in this beautiful bouquet and they're tied at the bottom. And so what you want to do is blanch it. Now what does that mean? Blanching means that you're going to boil it for 2 to 3 minutes just to get it partially soft. And then you're going to shock it in a bowl of ice water. Now what I typically do is I get a big bowl of really cold water and I put the broccoli in it after I've drained it and put it in the refrigerator for 10 minutes just to maintain the coolness. And then you take it out and you drain it, and then you have broccoli rabe that's been blanched. And what I love about blanched broccoli rabe is it maintains that incredibly vibrant green color. It is so beautiful. And you can smell that broccoli rabe sort of slight bitterness undertone to it. So what we're going to do with broccoli rabe, you don't just want the heads like with broccoli. Really, you're taking the stem. So I really cut off the section that was around where it was tied just because it was a bit less manageable. And then the stem and floret from above that is what I'm using. So we're going to put that in to the blender, and it's going to look like it's going to fill it up pretty well, but then once we start to pulse it, it's going to lower down in the food processor bin pretty quickly. So I'm going to put that in here, and okay, and of course a little bit extra liquid here that I'm just going to leave in the container. And then I'm going to pulse this first, and then I'm going to get the basil in there. So I'm just going to pulse it so you can get it into smaller bits so it's more manageable for the pesto. And now we're going to take the basil. Now this is about 2 cups of packed basil leaves that I took off the stems and I washed it and I drained it. And what I use is just a salad spinner to help to get all the liquid off of it. But it is so incredibly fragrant. And even, you know, different times of the year, there's a lot of different places that will offer basil from greenhouses. So you can really get it at all times of the year. And it's such a wonderful, fragrant, and really healthy way to get nice green vegetables in your diet. So we're going to put in the 2 cups of packed basil. And then we're just going to pulse it again. Let's do that because we want to get all of it down in there so we can add the other ingredients. And we might need to use a spatula to scrape down the sides a little bit to make room for everything. I'm just going to turn it on to get the basil to go down into the broccoli rabe and get incorporated. Certainly is turning into a sort of pseudo paste. We haven't added any of our liquid ingredients yet, but we're going to be doing that shortly. But I'm going to scrape down the sides. Oh God, this is so fragrant and beautiful to look at. So green. So Now it's just really in a paste but without liquid. And so now we're going to add in our other ingredients. So we're going to put some sea salt in. Now I always use sea salt because there's such a benefit to it. There's so many wonderful minerals in it, and we don't have to deal so much with the elevated sodium that we can get from having an excessive amount of table salt. And you can get it fine, so it has a consistency of table salt. You can get it coarse, like Himalayan sea salt, and it has so many wonderful nutritional properties. So we're going to put in a half a teaspoon of sea salt. I'm going to use my measuring spoon, but after a while you're just going to kind of do it by feel. And sprinkle that in. And you might find afterwards when you taste test it that you want a little bit more sea salt in, and then you can put more in. And then we're going to put in really 1 to 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, but I love to use fresh lemon juice. So I typically would take a whole lemon and juice it in a cup, and I might pour half of it in, and then see if afterwards when I taste it, if I wanted to have a little bit more of a lemon tartness to it. And then because of the because of the bitterness of the broccoli rabe, I typically will use a little bit of honey, and particularly because I'm having my kids eat this, and for them it's a little bit too bitter on its own. And for people that aren't used to having broccoli rabe, then I'll add a little bit of sweetness to it. And so I'll just take a teaspoon of honey and just drizzle it in. And I found that if I wet my spoon first, I'll get more of that honey off of the spoon. And as much as I'd like to lick this spoon right now, I don't, because then I'm going to have that sweetness in my mouth. And when I taste test the pesto, it's going to be sort of a biased flavor because of the sweetness already in my mouth. So I'm not going to taste test or lick the honey off the spoon. And then what we're going to do is we're going to close the food processor, and we're going to get our olive oil. Now, normally I would use a higher quality olive oil. In West Hartford, Connecticut, there's a wonderful store called Bella Gusta that has all these specialty olive oils, and so you can drizzle those in. You feel the robust, overpowering if you put too much in. So when it's a higher quality, kind of more higher end sourced olive oil, specialty oil, then you want to start with even less. And see how the flavor is to you. Now in this case, it calls for a quarter to a third of a cup of olive oil. So we're going to take our olive oil and we're going to pour in, and you really want to have measurements going because you want to be careful not to do too much because then it gets really oily and hard to spread. So we're going to open up our pouring spout here. We're going to turn this on, and then we're going to slowly drizzle in the olive oil. And then midway through, we're going to stop and we're going to scrape down the sides. And it's looking fantastically green and beautiful. And we're going to turn it on again. And every time we turn it on, it's going to get a little bit smoother, but you'll notice that this is a little bit of a more chunky consistency than typical pesto because of the broccoli rabe. It has a little bit of a different consistency to it. And let's see, we'll turn it on one more time and the rest of it. Let it run. And now we're going to taste test it, and let's see if we need any more lemon juice or even salt. Oh, that's delicious. I think we could use a touch more lemon juice. I'm just going to take probably the quarter bit of this lemon juice back in and put the top back on. I think it's enough olive oil. We're just going to turn it on again. Incorporate. And I think that's good to go. So we're going to taste test it one more time. Oh, that is so delicious. Absolutely delicious. And so let's get this stuff out of our way. And we're going to do some spreading. So we've got our pizza crust here. We got here the two. And so we're just going to take a spatula and we're going to take the blade out of here so we don't hurt ourselves. And we're going to take half of this pesto out for one and half for the other. And we're just going to spread it out, literally. You can see what I'm doing here. I'm just spreading it out with my spatula. It's got a nice, easy consistency. You might want to leave a little bit of dough on the edges so you have a crust. Now, sometimes what I'll take is I'll take some sun-dried tomatoes and I'll put them on top before I put this back in the oven to warm, and it's just partly like a garnish, and it just makes it look really pretty. Let's see here. And let's get the other. And there we go. Just spreading this out. It's really, really simple to do. And it's so beautifully green and so fragrant. The slight bitterness you can even smell from the broccoli rabe, but also the richness of the olive oil and the tartness of the lemon juice. And it's just so beautiful because the broccoli rabe was blanched. A little bit more here that we can put on these little bits of space that are visible of crust on that first one on the right. And then do that. And you can see the way it looks. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pause this video. We're going to put this in the oven, and then we're going to come back and taste test it. So thanks so much, and tune in just a moment.